I remember the night so vividly it still makes my skin crawl. It was supposed to be a fun, peaceful camping trip, a weekend getaway with nothing but nature to keep us company. My buddy Alex and I had driven out to this spot deep in the forest, way off the beaten path. No cell service, no other campers, just us, the trees, and the endless stretch of dark sky. It was the kind of isolation we thought we'd enjoy, but now I wish we'd never gone. The first night started out normal enough. We set up camp, built a fire, and talked about life while the crackling flames cast shadows on the trees. It wasn't until late into the night, when the fire had burned down to embers, that we noticed something strange. The forest, which had been alive with the chirps of crickets and rustling leaves, had gone dead silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. It was like someone had hit mute on the world. At first we laughed it off, joking that the woods were just getting ready for bed. But then we heard it, a faint, rhythmic crunch of leaves, like footsteps, somewhere just beyond the firelight. We called out, thinking maybe it was a deer or a fox, but there was no reply. Just that steady, deliberate sound moving closer. Alex grabbed his flashlight, shining it into the trees, but it barely pierced the darkness. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice trembling slightly. No answer. But I swear, in that split second, I saw something, a shadow, or maybe a figure, ducking behind a tree. That was when the unease turned into full-blown dread, because whatever it wasn't running away. It was circling us, and it knew we were alone. After that first night of eerie silence, we didn't sleep much. Every time we thought the forest might settle back into normalcy, another strange noise would echo through the trees. A snapping branch, a rustling bush, or something heavier, like a soft thud. By morning, Alex and I were exhausted, but we chalked it up to nerves. Probably just animals, we kept telling ourselves, even though neither of us really believed it. The next day, we decided to explore the area, hoping daylight would ease our paranoia. We hiked a bit further into the forest, passing dense thickets and ancient trees that towered like sentinels. The deeper we went, the more the air seemed to thicken. It wasn't just the humidity. It was something heavier, like an invisible weight pressing down on us. As we reached a small clearing, I noticed something strange. Branches on the ground arranged in odd, deliberate patterns. They weren't scattered like debris, but placed carefully in shapes. Circles, triangles, even one that looked like an arrow pointing back toward our campsite. I laughed nervously and tried to brush it off as coincidence, but Alex just stared at it, his jaw tight. "That's weird, right?" he muttered. It was when we started heading back that things really took a turn. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I swore I saw movement, just beyond the edge of my vision. At one point, Alex froze mid-step, gripping my arm so hard it hurt. "Did you see that?" he whispered. I hadn't, but the terror in his eyes was enough. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. No matter how fast we walked, it felt like something or someone was keeping pace with us, hiding in the shadows, just out of sight. That night, the tension was unbearable. The forest had returned to its unnatural silence. But every now and then, we'd hear something, a faint rustle, a soft knock on wood, or worse, what sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps circling our campsite. Alex tried to stay calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Neither of us wanted to admit how wrong this all felt. At one point, Alex insisted on checking the perimeter. "I'll be quick," he said, grabbing the flashlight and stepping into the darkness beyond the firelight. I wanted to stop him, but my voice caught in my throat. I just nodded and watched as the beam of his flashlight flickered between the trees. Minutes passed, too many. "Alex?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. The forest seemed to swallow my words. I stood up, my heart hammering, and took a few steps toward where he'd disappeared. "Alex!" I shouted again, louder this time. Still nothing. And then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. But they weren't his. They were lighter, uneven, and they didn't seem to be approaching. They were moving away. I froze, torn between chasing after them or staying put. My instinct screamed at me to stay. Finally, Alex's flashlight appeared in the distance, the beam jittering wildly as he stumbled back into the clearing. "We have to leave," he gasped, his face pale. Before I could ask what happened, he grabbed my arm and pointed to the ground near the edge of our campsite. Footprints, dozens of them, barefoot, human-like, but not quite right. The toes were too long, the heel too narrow, and they circled our camp in chaotic, overlapping patterns. "They weren't mine," Alex whispered, his voice trembling, "and they definitely weren't alone." The forest felt alive that night. Alive in a way that made my skin crawl, like the trees themselves were watching, waiting. The fire crackled faintly as Alex and I sat in silence, staring at the eerie footprints that surrounded our campsite. Neither of us wanted to speak. What could we even say? We didn't know what was out there, but we both felt it now. An overwhelming, suffocating presence. It started with a sound, a low, guttural growl, faint but unmistakable, carried on the still air. "Did you hear that?" Alex whispered, clutching the flashlight like it was a lifeline. I nodded, too afraid to speak. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable crunch of heavy footsteps. Alex stood up, the flashlight beam darting wildly between the trees. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was nothing but the deafening silence. Then out of the darkness, a scream tore through the air. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was high-pitched, animalistic, and it seemed to echo from every direction at once. Alex dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning as it hit the ground, casting disorienting shadows. I scrambled to pick it up, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. That's when we saw it. Just for a second. A figure, impossibly tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the firelight. Its limbs were too long, its movements unnaturally jerky, like a puppet on strings. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a pale, featureless void. Alex screamed, and the thing lunged toward him. I don't know how I found the strength, but I grabbed his arm, yanked him back, and we ran. The thing didn't chase us, but the sound of that inhuman scream followed us, echoing through the trees long after we'd left the campsite behind. To this day, I don't know what it was, or if it was even real, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never go camping again. We didn't stop running until the forest thinned, and we reached the dirt road where we'd parked the car. I can't even describe the relief of seeing that beaten-up old truck waiting for us, bathed in the cold light of the moon. Alex fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to get the door open. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that thing emerge from the darkness, its long, unnatural limbs reaching for us. But it didn't. Once we were in the truck, Alex floored it, tearing down the narrow road as fast as he could without flipping us into a ditch. The headlights barely cut through the night, and every shadow we passed felt like it was watching us, following us. Neither of us spoke the entire drive back to town. What could we say? When we finally made it to safety, the sun was just starting to rise, painting the horizon in soft hues of pink and orange. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Alex parked the truck outside a diner, and we just sat there in silence, staring at the steering wheel. After a while, he muttered, "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded. I didn't have the strength to lie. We tried to move on, to tell ourselves it was over, that we'd escaped. But there are nights when I wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced I hear footsteps outside my window. Alex stopped responding to my calls a few months after that trip. I drove to his place once, but it was empty. Just a cold, quiet house with the lights still on. Sometimes I wonder if it let us go, or if it's just waiting for the right time to come back. If you're thinking of camping, do yourself a favor. Stay where people can hear you scream.